Thank you, Andrew. Kia ora tatou. Good to see everyone. What I hope to do this evening is to share an extended book review of James Cone's important work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, with time at the end for questions and discussion. Just before I go further, if I could get a quick thumbs up if I'm coming through all right and you're hearing me. Yep, thank you. When we decided on the topics for this new series of Zoom events, I chose to speak on this because of some writing I'll be doing with colleagues in the US and UK on lynching and crucifixion in Cone's work next year. However, with the death of George Floyd in May 2020 and the Black Lives protests which followed, as Andrew mentioned, the topic has become much more immediately relevant. My main hope in what follows is encourage you to read this important work for yourself, especially in light of the issues raised by Black Lives Matter. I'll be focusing on two areas. First, a brief introduction to the life and work of James Cone. Secondly, a focus on his book, as Andrew said, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where Cone draws on the terrors of lynching for an understanding of the terrors of the cross, and vice versa. As you would expect with these subjects, I'll touch on some material that is challenging and confronting. I don't intend to show images of graphic violence or to go into too much close detail. But please be aware that both crucifixion and lynching are hard subjects to discuss. And if you're watching in a shared space, or if there are people around who can overhear, please also be aware of anyone else who might be around you as well. If you heard my inaugural professorial lecture on the legacies of liberation theology, you may recall me speaking about James Cone and how grateful I am that I was a master's student at Union Theological Seminary, New York in 1987 to 88. If you didn't hear that lecture at the time, but are interested, it's available through the university website, and it should be accessible from my staff page, which is on the slide here, or you can just Google my name, Atago, and I think you'll probably track it down. Let's turn first to James Cone's life and work. As many of you know, Professor Cone is widely acknowledged as the founding figure in US Black liberation theology, and one of the theological giants of recent times. He was born 5th of August 1938 in Fordyce, Arkansas, and grew up in Bearden, Arkansas. His family attended the local Macedonia African Methodist Episcopal Church, and Cone's education included 2 years at the AME Junior College, Shorter College, between 54 and 56, before receiving a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1958 from Philander Smith College after a further 2 years of study. At that point, he moved north to Chicago for his Bachelor of Divinity degree at Garrett Theological Seminary, which he was awarded in 1961. He continued into the doctoral program with a Master of Arts awarded 1963 and his PhD in systematic theology, where he wrote his dissertation on the Swiss theologian Karl Barth, awarded in 1965. He taught theology briefly at Philander Smith College and was then appointed to Adrian College in Michigan, where he taught between 1966 and 69, and then moved in 1969 to Union Theological Seminary, New York, where he remained for his distinguished teaching career for nearly 50 years. Cone's autobiography is highly recommended and gives an excellent overview of his work and writing. It's titled, Said I Wasn't Gonna Tell Nobody, The Making of a Black Theologian, and was published posthumously in 2018, a few months after his death on 28th April 2018. The title is intentionally ironic. It takes its form from a line in a traditional gospel hymn. The first line is, I said I wasn't going to tell nobody, but then it continues, but I couldn't keep it to myself. couldn't keep it to myself, repeated 3 times, and then the next line explains why. Said I wasn't going to tell nobody, but I couldn't keep it to myself, what the Lord has done for me. So although the title of the autobiography suggests he's not going to tell people, it's an ironic indication that actually he feels compelled to tell people. He feels compelled by what the Lord has done in his life to speak about it. If you're not familiar with the gospel song, you can find it on YouTube. There's a link in the slides to a version sung by the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir. This is the choir who sang at the second inauguration of Barack Obama on 20th of January 2013, and they're really uplifting to listen to. We don't have much time to go into detail on his works, but I have just grouped them in this slide to give a sense of his writing. I've put them in 4 sections. In his early work, he established Black liberation theology, and these books included Black Theology and Black Power, A Black Theology of Liberation, For Spirituals and the Blues, and God of the Oppressed. Then in the 80s, he developed his earlier ideas further, but also started to discuss Black theology's connections to other liberation theologies. And this group includes My Soul Looks Back, which was an autobiographical work, his first autobiography of the first part of his career. For My People, focusing particularly on the Black church, and Speaking the Truth. In the early 90s, he published a major study on Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, Martin and Malcolm and America. And he also edited a collection of earlier writings, Risks of Faith. And then, and the focus for this evening, is the book The Cross and the Lynching Tree, 2011. And finally, of course, his autobiography, Said I Wasn't Going to Tell Nobody, 2018. In the introduction to The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Cone writes, "This work is a continuation and culmination of all my previous books, each of them in different ways motivated by a central question: how to reconcile the gospel message of liberation with the reality of Black oppression. But in many ways, this book is particularly personal. Its subject brings me back to my first memories of hearing the gospel, as well as back to primal memories of terror and violence that were part of the reality of growing up in the Jim Crow South." At Union Seminary, Cone had a reputation as an outstanding supervisor of doctoral students. Many of his students went on to publish their dissertation as impressive books, and I heard more than one of them complain that Professor Cone would not allow them to submit their PhD until he was certain it was ready to be a good book. Looking at the contents page and structure for The Cross and the Lynching Tree, it's almost as if Cone wanted to model a process for future doctoral students on writing a great book. Each chapter stands as a significant piece of work, which might be read in its own right and just for itself, whilst also making a powerful contribution to the argument as a whole. I'm going to be offering some extracts from each chapter in the slides which follow, and much of this is Cone's own material rather than mine. There will be some key quotes on the slides and other passages which I will read from the book, along with a few explanatory comments of my own to go with them. If you're unsure about what is taken from Cone and what is mine, that's all the more reason to purchase the book and read it for yourself. In his introductory chapter, Cone starts by observing a contrast. While the lynching tree is seldom discussed or depicted, he says, the cross is one of the most visible symbols of America's Christian origins. Yet the cross, which is all too familiar in America, is not really the cross of history, or indeed the cross of the gospel. Cone says, the cross has been transformed into a harmless, non-offensive ornament that Christians wear around their necks, rather than reminding us of the cost of discipleship, to use Bonhoeffer's term. It has become a form of cheap grace, again to reference Bonhoeffer. And Cone believes that attention to lynching will show the cross in a very different way. In chapter 1, he turns to Nobody Knows the Troubles I See. It offers an overview of lynching and the terror it created in Black communities. You'll notice that this title is also taken from a well-known spiritual from the time of slavery. The lynching tree is the most potent symbol of the trouble nobody knows that Blacks have seen, says Cone. But they don't talk about it because of the pain of remembering. Visions of Black bodies dangling from southern trees, surrounded by jeering white mobs, is almost too excruciating to recall. In this chapter, Cone explains the background to lynching and how it was used. So I'll take a little bit of time to describe this. Lynching originated in the War of Independence, when the conventional institutions of justice were unavailable. After independence, it developed further to deal with lawlessness as the US moved westward. And initially it could take different forms as community retribution against offenders. For example, whipping, shooting, stabbing, as well as hanging. It was used against outlaw whites, Mexicans, Native Americans, and Chinese. During the slave era, because Blacks were considered valuable property, they were usually not lynched, but they were whipped or raped. After the Civil War, following the Reconstruction Act of 1867, the era of Black lynching began. The Ku Klux Klan was founded as a social club in 1866, but quickly became a vigilante organization, determined to preserve white supremacy by terrorizing Blacks, and lynching was central to this. During the Reconstruction era, 1867 to 1877, the military occupation of the South offered Blacks some protection, but after Reconstruction ended, Blacks had minimal protection from the law. Historians have identified the names of nearly 5,000 Blacks lynched in the period 1880 to 1940. Typically, lynching involved either hanging the victim with a rope and noose or suspending the victim by a chain. Often victims who had been suspended on chains were then lowered onto a burning pyre, and this could be done repeatedly. Lynching was often accompanied by mutilation of the body before, during, or after the execution, and this frequently included genital mutilation or castration. The justification for lynching was seen by many whites as the danger of rape or the threat to white women's honor. Excuse me, I just lost my place. The threat to white women's honor that Black men supposedly posed to white women. Cone writes, but now, without slavery to control Blacks, new means had to be devised, and even a new rationale for control. This was supplied by Black men's imagined insatiable lust for white women. Because of their threat to white womanhood, Black men must be carefully watched and violently kept in their place, segregated and subordinated. Now, this mythical justification for lynching was debunked at a factual level by Ida B. Wells, and that's the woman featured in your slide, in her work Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, published in 1892. Wells was a reporter and part owner of a newspaper in Memphis, and she started investigating lynchings after a lynching in Memphis in 1892. In May 1892, she published an editorial in her paper disputing the allegation that Black men rape white women. In response, her newspaper office was burnt to the ground, Fortunately, she was in New York at the time, and she was forced to stay there. In October 1892, she published Southern Horrors to expose the lie of Black alleged rape. Drawing on reports in white newspapers, she showed that a sexual motivation was only suggested in a minority of lynch cases. Drawing on court records, she also showed that in at least some of these, there had been consensual relations until the white woman was discovered, or feared discovery, at which time she claimed that she had been assaulted. Wells followed this with the Red Record in 1895, which showed the prevalence of lynching in southern states. Cone discusses the work of Wells in chapter 5, and I'll come back to that later. The point here is that despite Wells's work as early as 1892, the threat of black males to white women remained the most used justification for lynching through to 1940, and was widely shared in popular mythology. The term lynching can be used in different ways. In its narrower sense, it refers not just to extrajudicial mob violence, but to instances where the mob removed a victim from the custody of the sheriff or marshal. That is to say, the victim was already under arrest, in custody, and facing investigation or trial. However, instead of waiting for a trial and due process, the lynch mob took the matter into their own hands. In some cases, the officers of the law resisted the mob, or at least tried to, but were often unsuccessful. In other cases, little was done to prevent the mob. The organisers of lynching were often the established and respectable leaders of the white community, including church ministers and those who saw themselves as Christian. Lynchings were usually public spectacles. They were sometimes advertised in advance and attended by large crowds, which could run into thousands. In some cases, special trains were advertised and organised to carry spectators from surrounding towns and cities, and crowds might be 10 or even 20,000. Spectators included whole families and were a social event. Cone writes, "It was a family affair, a ritual celebration of white supremacy, where women and children were often given the first opportunity to torture black victims, burning black flesh and cutting off genitals, fingers, toes, and ears as souvenirs." Spectators also took photos to remember and share the event. Newspapers took photos and afterwards might make these into postcards that people purchased and sent. Although lynching was by definition a lawless act, minimal effort was made to hold those responsible. In many cases, newspapers reported that the executions were done by, quote, persons unknown, even when the people were in fact well known in the community and had made no effort to hide their identity. Above all, Cone points to lynching as an instrument of terror. He writes, "Lynching was the white community's way of forcibly reminding blacks of their inferiority and powerlessness. To be black meant that whites could do anything to you and your people, and that neither you nor anyone else could do anything about it." On top of this, as he points out, threats of lynching were often more effective than the act itself. So that's chapter 1, where Cone outlines lynching as a form of terror. In chapter 2, he offers a sustained critique of Reinhold Niebuhr's silence on lynching. The chapter title in this case, "The Terrible Beauty of the Cross," is taken from a piece Niebuhr himself wrote in 1929. Cone starts the chapter by summarising his main argument. The lynching tree, so strikingly similar to the cross on Golgotha, should have a prominent place in American images of Jesus' death, but it does not. In fact, the lynching tree has no place in American theological reflections about Jesus' cross or in the proclamation of Christian churches about his passion. The conspicuous absence of the lynching tree in American theological discourse and preaching is profoundly revealing, especially since the crucifixion was clearly a first-century lynching. In the lynching era, between 1880 to 1940, white Christians lynched nearly 5,000 black men and women in a manner with obvious echoes of the Roman crucifixion of Jesus. Yet these Christians did not see the irony or contradiction in their actions. Cone asks how it was that white Christians could miss this connection. He writes, "The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans in Jerusalem and the lynching of blacks by whites in the United States are so amazingly similar that one wonders what blocks the American Christian imagination from seeing the connection." In answer to this question, Cone notes that it's not surprising that overt white supremacist Christians should have failed to recognize the similarity between the cross and the lynching tree. But how should we understand the failure of somebody like Niebuhr, who doesn't fall into this category? Niebuhr was one of the most progressive of America's white theologians, and widely regarded as America's most influential theologian in the 20th century, speaking especially from his position at Union Theological Seminary. And, as Cone notes, he was sensitive to the evils of racism, and wrote on many occasions on the sufferings of African Americans. Furthermore, Niebuhr gave particular attention to the cross in his work, which he saw as the heart of the Christian gospel. Yet Cone says, and yet even he failed to connect the cross and its most vivid reenactment in his time. To reflect on this failure is to address a defect in the conscience of white Christians, and to suggest why African Americans have needed to trust and cultivate their own theological imagination. Cone argues that Niebuhr failed by omission and by silence. He observes, Niebuhr wrote 4 books on American history, but did not deal with racial issues in any substantive way. To sum up, Chapter 2 is about the failure of white theology to understand the cross and the lynching tree. This includes both the failure of segregationist racist theologies, which support lynching without seeing any contradiction to the cross, and alongside that also the different but still very serious failure of liberal or progressive theologies, which literally had nothing to say and remained silent about lynching. In Chapter 3, Cone turns to work by black church leaders on lynching and focuses especially on Martin Luther King. He opens the chapter with the brutal lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till on 28 August 1955. Till's lynching had a galvanizing effect in the 1950s. In some ways, the way that the murder of George Floyd in 2020 served to spark outrage over a much wider issue. So in the same way, Till's murder had an extraordinary impact. King described it as one of the most brutal and inhuman crimes in the 20th century. The teenage Till lived in Chicago and was spending summer with relatives in rural Mississippi. On 24th August, there was an incident in a general store. The factual details are much discussed, but also disputed. There were allegations that Till was inappropriate or insulting in his behaviour to the woman's store owner, a perceived attitude of undue familiarity. It was claimed he said, "Bye, baby," or perhaps whistled as he left the store. All of this was covered in newspapers, but is also disputed. Rumours spread, and Till was abducted from his relative's house 4 days later. Eventually, he was beaten, mutilated, shot in the head, dumped in the river with the body weighed down by a large gin fan. When the body was eventually recovered, it was taken back to Chicago, with his face and head virtually unrecognizable. However, his mother insisted that despite the disfigurement, his body should be displayed in open casket prior to the funeral. She wanted to display the brutality in plain sight, so everyone would see what had happened to her boy. Photos of the casket in Jet magazine attracted worldwide attention, and crowds queued to pay their respects. The suspects were arrested and tried, but acquitted by an all-white jury. The lynching of Emmett Till and the impact it had deserves a lecture all to itself. As already noted, it had a profound effect on King, and Cone points out that King had started his ministry at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in the neighbouring state of Alabama only a year before. In addition, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People sent a young and talented investigator, Rosa Parks, to investigate and report on what happened to Till, and Parks was deeply troubled by what she learned. On 27th November 1955, Parks attended a meeting at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church to discuss Till's murder, along with other racist killings. 4 days later, on 1st December 55, Rosa Parks was riding a bus in Montgomery. When a white passenger got on, she refused to give up her seat and moved to the back of the bus, so the passenger could take her seat. This started the Montgomery bus boycott as a key period in the civil rights struggle led by King. Parks later explained that when she made her decision, what had happened to Till was on her mind. King's preaching sustained and shaped the spirituality of the civil rights struggle, and Cone shows that bearing the cross was a frequent theme in King's sermons. Cone says, King saw the cross as a source of strength and courage, the ultimate expression of God's love for humanity. Furthermore, King saw in Jesus' unmerited suffering on the cross God's answer to black suffering on the lynching tree. Cone writes a little later in the book, great preachers preach the cross as the heart of the Christian message. The Apostle Paul preached the cross and transformed a Jewish sect into a faith for the world. Martin Luther preached the cross and started the Protestant Reformation. Karl Barth preached the cross and created a Copernican revolution in European theology. Reinhold Niebuhr preached the cross and developed a creative response on Christian social ethics in America. Fannie Lou Hamer sang and preached the cross and ignited a grassroots revolution in Mississippi. Martin Luther King preached the cross and transformed the social and political life in America, pointing to an American dream of justice, for which he gave his life. However, although King saw the cross as the answer to the lynching tree, he did not press this understanding into a deeper awareness of the connection between the two. He did not draw on the experience of lynching for a new understanding of the cross. Thus, despite the similarity of cross and lynching tree, a clear connection between them is not to be found in the work of white theologians or in the work of black church leaders like King. Instead of being recognized in the theology or in the churches, or as might be expected, it was instead black artists and writers who came to make the connection explicit in their work. In chapter 4, therefore, Cone explores the connection that black artists and writers drew between lynching and crucifixion, with lynch victims seen as Christ crucified again. The writer Countee Cullen was a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance, and his poem, Christ Re-Crucified, from which Cone draws the title for chapter 4, includes the lines, "The South is crucifying Christ again," as a reference to lynching. Cone writes, like Cullen, many black poets, novelists, painters, dramatists, and other artists saw clearly that what white theologians and clergy ignored, and what black religious scholars and ministers merely alluded to, that in the United States, the clearest image of the crucified Christ was the figure of the innocent black victim dangling from a lynching tree. Cone noted that black artists were typically familiar with the church and the gospel, but were not regular church attenders. But they were courageously honest about black life and suffering, and they had an appropriate creative imagination to see the cross in the lynching tree. Cullen's poem, Black Christ, makes a similar connection, as does Walter Everett Hawkins in A Festival in Christendom, 1920. Cone also points out that visual artists painted an image of Christ on the cross and painted him black. They were also referencing Christ as a lynched victim. Simply turning him from white to black switched the visual signifiers, making him one with the body of the lynched black people in America. Writers made a similar connection. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of the lynching industry and wrote extensively about lynching. In his book, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois criticised the white Jesus. And Cone writes, Du Bois used the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, to keep the religious meaning of the lynching theme before the American public, especially before the black community. The December 1916 issue of The Crisis conveyed this message in a powerful painting called Christmas in Georgia, which depicts a black man held up with the silhouette image of Jesus, while an angry mob of white men hoist the victim with a rope. On the tree on which the black man hangs, there is a sign that reads, "Inasmuch as you did it unto the least of these, my brethren, you did it unto me." The contradictions between the gospel message and the reality of lynching, Cone says, or more precisely, the relation between what white Christians did to blacks and what the Romans did to Jesus, was reflected in a photo that appeared in the December 1919 issue of The Crisis with the title, The Crucifixion in Omaha. It was a photo of a burned victim with a throng of white men observing their handiwork. Chapter 5, the last main chapter, is one which again takes its title from a spiritual. In this chapter, Cone focuses on black women and lynching. He notes that sometimes women were lynched instead of men. For example, when mobs came to find a man but couldn't find him, they might take a woman relative instead. He gives extensive attention to the work of Ida Wells, already mentioned, and her investigations in Southern horrors and the Red Record. This is also the chapter where he discusses the powerful song Strange Fruit, written as a poem in 1937 by Abel Maripoul, a Jewish American schoolteacher and songwriter, who published under the pseudonym Lewis Allen. Maripoul cited a well-known photograph of the lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith in Marion, Indiana in 1930 as the inspiration for his protest poem. He set the lyrics to music and performed the song together with his wife in the 1930s. It then became famous when the singer Billie Holiday started singing it in 1939 as the signature end to her act at the Cafe Society nightclub in New York. If you're not familiar with it, it's a powerful song. You can listen to Billie Holiday sing it at the YouTube link on the slide there. And there's a documentary on BBC Radio 4 that says more about its extraordinary story. To move to a conclusion, Cone draws the different strands together. He affirms the lynching era was the heart of darkness for the African American community. He also offers a reminder of the guiding principle in Black liberation theology. The Christian gospel is God's message of liberation in an unredeemed and tortured world. Cone says, one has to have a powerful religious imagination to see redemption in the cross, to discover life in death and hope in tragedy. Reflecting on Hebrews 6:6, he continues, And yet another type of imagination is necessary. The imagination to relate the message of the cross to one's own social reality. To see that they are crucifying again the Son of God. Both Jesus and blacks were strange fruit. Theologically speaking, Jesus was the first lynchee, who overshadowed all the lynched black bodies on American soil. He was crucified by the same principalities and powers that lynched black people in America. Because God was present with Jesus on the cross, and thereby refused to let Satan and death have the last word about his meaning, God was also present at every lynching in the United States. God saw what whites did to innocent and helpless blacks and claimed their suffering as God's own. God transformed lynched black bodies into the re-crucified body of Christ. Every time a white mob lynched a black person, they lynched Jesus. The lynching tree is the cross in America. When American Christians realize that they can meet Jesus only in the crucified bodies in our midst, they will encounter the real scandal of the cross. Yet, as he showed in earlier chapters, this is what even the best of white theologians have failed to do. And so Cone argues, the cross and the lynching tree interpret each other. Both were public spectacles, shameful events, instruments of punishment reserved for the most despised people in society. Any genuine theology and any genuine preaching of the Christian gospel must be measured against the test of the scandal of the cross and the lynching tree. In his book, Cone has struggled with two key questions. He says, can the cross redeem the lynching tree? And can the lynching tree liberate the cross and make it real in American history? He answers these questions so seriously that he concludes, as I see it, the lynching tree frees the cross from the false pieties of well-meaning Christianity. Yet the lynching tree also needs the cross, without which it becomes an abomination. It is the cross that points in the direction of hope. So, thank you for this opportunity to share this remarkably powerful book, the themes that it opens up. I look forward to the discussion and just hearing from you what you make of this and your thoughts on the topic. At this point, I'll hand over to you, Andrew, to end the recording and to open up the chat.